The storm had been building for 3 days before it finally broke over the mountains, and by the time it did, nobody in the valley below dared to travel. The wind came first, a low moaning that rattled the shutters of every farmhouse for miles, and then the snow followed, thick and relentless, swallowing the world in white. Elias Rourke had been warned not to go, warned by his brother, warned by the innkeeper, warned even by the old shepherd who claimed he could smell a blizzard 3 days before it arrived. But Elias had made a promise to his dying father, and promises, in his family, were not things a man broke simply because the sky had turned the color of ash. His father had spoken of a woman who lived alone in the high passes, a widow named Marta who had once saved his life during a hunting accident decades ago, patching his wounds and feeding him through a fever that should have killed him. Elias had grown up hearing stories of Marta the widow, tales that had grown taller with every retelling, until she had become in his mind something between a legend and a ghost, a woman who lived in the rock itself, forgotten by time, surviving alone against impossible odds. His father's dying wish had been simple. Find her. Make sure she is not alone. Bring her down from the mountain if she will come, and if she will not, then at least let her know she was not forgotten. So Elias set out with his young cousin Toby, a boy of 16 who had begged to come along because he had never seen snow fall the way it fell in the high country, and because he adored his older cousin and would have followed him into far worse than a storm. They took the sturdiest mule they owned, loaded with blankets, dried meat, a small cask of brandy, and enough rope to pull a man from a crevasse if it came to that. The road wound upward through pine forests that grew thinner and more skeletal the higher they climbed, until at last there were no trees at all, only rock and ice and the howling wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. By the second hour, Toby's teeth were chattering so hard he could barely speak, and Elias began to regret bringing him, though he said nothing, knowing that turning back now would be nearly as dangerous as pressing on. The path, such as it was, had long since vanished beneath drifts of snow that in places rose to their knees, and the mule, sensible creature that it was, began to balk, refusing to move forward into gusts that threatened to knock a grown man off his feet. It was Toby who first spotted the cave, or rather, spotted the donkey standing near its entrance, a shape so incongruous against the white chaos of the storm that at first he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. He shouted, his voice torn away almost instantly by the wind, but Elias saw where he was pointing and turned the mule toward it, and as they drew closer, the mouth of the cave opened before them like a mercy neither of them had dared to hope for. The donkey stood placidly near the entrance, laden with supplies, seemingly unbothered by the storm raging just beyond the rock overhang that sheltered it, and beyond the donkey, deep in the shadows of the cave, there was a warm and flickering orange light that neither man nor boy could quite believe they were seeing. They had expected, if they found anything at all, a frozen woman huddled beneath rags, perhaps already gone, her body stiff and blue in some forgotten corner of the mountain, the tragic ending to a story that had haunted Elias's father for 30 years. What they found instead defied every expectation they had carried up that mountain path. The cave was enormous, far larger than either of them had imagined from the outside, its walls carved and smoothed by countless years of habitation, hung with drying herbs and strings of onions and garlic that swayed gently in the warm air rising from somewhere deeper within. The smell hit Elias first, a smell so unexpected and so achingly familiar that it stopped him in his tracks just past the entrance, snow still clinging to his shoulders and beard. It was the smell of bread. Fresh bread, baking, the yeasty warmth of it curling through the cold air pouring in from outside and mixing with wood smoke and the earthy scent of stored vegetables, and for a moment Elias simply stood there, disoriented, wondering if the cold had finally addled his mind and conjured some cruel and comforting hallucination. But then a dog barked, a great shaggy thing that lifted its head from where it lay curled near a glowing stone oven, and the sound was so ordinary, so utterly real, that it snapped Elias back into the moment, and he realized that what he was seeing was no trick of a freezing brain but simply, impossibly, the truth of the place. A woman stood before the oven, her sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cold gusting in behind the visitors, a wooden peel in her hands with a fresh loaf balanced on its blade, steam rising from the bread's cracked golden crust into the firelight. Her hair was dark and curling, streaked here and there with silver that caught the glow of the oven's coals, and her face, when she turned toward the sound of the dog's bark and the crunch of boots on the cave floor, was not the face of a broken or forgotten woman, but of someone entirely at home in her own life, weathered by years of work but far from ruined by them. Behind her, at a long wooden table cluttered with more loaves cooling under cloths, a young girl looked up in surprise, clutching a warm roll to her chest as if it were a small treasure, her eyes wide at the sight of two snow-crusted strangers standing at the cave's entrance. Further back, shelves carved into the rock held clay jars and baskets, and beyond them, in a section of the cave open to a natural skylight where the storm's gray light mixed strangely with the warm gold of hanging lanterns, crates of vegetables sat heaped and abundant, carrots and beets and potatoes and great pale heads of cabbage, more food than Elias had expected to see stored anywhere in the entire valley below, let alone in a cave halfway up a mountain in the grip of a blizzard. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Elias felt Toby's hand grip his sleeve, the boy too stunned by the warmth and the smell of food to do anything but stare, and the woman regarded them both with a calm, appraising look of someone who had learned long ago not to be startled by strangers appearing out of storms. It was the dog that broke the silence, rising from its place by the fire and padding over to sniff at their boots with a friendliness that suggested visitors, however unexpected, were not entirely unwelcome in this place. The woman set down her peel, resting the fresh loaf on the edge of the table, and wiped her hands on her apron before speaking, and when she did, her voice was low and warm, carrying a trace of an accent Elias couldn't quite place, softened perhaps by years of speaking to no one but a dog, a donkey, and, evidently, a girl who was watching the newcomers with unabashed curiosity. "You look half frozen," the woman said simply, as though two strangers stumbling into her cave during a blizzard were the most natural occurrence in the world. "Come in properly, close to the fire, before the cold takes what little sense you have left." Elias found himself moving before he had even decided to, pulled forward by the warmth and the impossible, wonderful smell of the bread, and Toby followed close behind, the mule left tethered near the donkey at the entrance where the overhang would shield it from the worst of the wind. As Elias came nearer to the light, he studied the woman's face more closely, searching for some resemblance to the descriptions his father had given him decades ago, and slowly, beneath the years and the healthy color the mountain air and hard work had given her, he began to see it. The same strong jaw his father had described. The same dark eyes, though they had certainly seen more winters since. He opened his mouth to ask, hesitated, and then simply said the name that had brought him up the mountain in the first place. "Marta." The woman went very still, her hands pausing where they had been reaching for a cloth to wrap around another loaf, and she looked at him now with an entirely different kind of attention, sharper, searching, as though trying to place his face among the fragments of a life she had perhaps thought long buried in her past. "That is a name I have not heard spoken by a stranger in a very long time," she said carefully. "Who sent you looking for it?" Elias explained then, the words tumbling out perhaps too quickly, driven by relief and cold and the strange emotion of finally meeting someone who had existed for him only as a story, a name attached to his father's gratitude and guilt in equal measure. He told her of his father, of the hunting accident so many years ago, of a young man who had been dying on a mountainside not unlike this one, and of the woman who had found him, stitched his wounds with steady hands, and fed him back to health over the course of a hard winter before helping him find his way back down to the valley in the spring. He told her of his father's final months, how the memory of her kindness had returned to him again and again as his own body failed, how his dying wish had been simply to know that she was not alone, that someone remembered what she had done. Marta listened to all of this with an expression that shifted slowly from wariness to something gentler, and when Elias finished speaking, she was quiet for a long moment, looking not at him but past him, toward the swirling snow visible through the cave's mouth, as though seeing in it the ghost of that long-ago winter. "Your father," she said finally, "was a foolish boy who tried to climb where he had no business climbing, and stubborn enough that even half dead, he argued with me about how to properly set a splint." A small, unexpected laugh escaped her then, and the tension in the cave seemed to ease all at once, the dog settling back down by the fire, the girl behind her relaxing enough to set down the roll she had been clutching and step forward with open curiosity. "I often wondered what became of him. I am glad to hear he lived a long life, though sorry to hear it has ended. Come, sit, both of you. You did not climb this mountain in a blizzard to stand shivering at my table while I ask questions that can wait until you have eaten." What followed was an evening neither Elias nor Toby would ever fully be able to describe to those who had not lived it. An evening so strange in its ordinariness, so warm in the face of the storm still howling just beyond the cave's mouth, that it seemed to exist slightly outside of time itself. Marta explained, as she set bread and cheese and a thick vegetable stew before them, that she had not always lived alone in the cave, that in the years after Elias's father had left, she had married a trader who traveled the mountain passes, and together they had discovered this place, a natural cave with a hidden skylight that let in sun during the warmer months, dry enough and defensible enough to serve as both home and storehouse. When her husband had died, some 15 years past now, taken by a fever much like the one that had nearly claimed Elias's father, she had chosen to stay rather than return to the valley, finding in the solitary rhythms of the mountain a kind of peace she had never known amid the noise and gossip of village life. The girl, it turned out, was not her daughter but her granddaughter, Ellen, the child of Marta's own daughter who had married into a trading family and traveled often, leaving Ellen in her grandmother's care for long stretches through the harvest and winter months, arrangement that suited both grandmother and granddaughter perfectly well. Marta had built, over the years, a small but thriving trade of her own, baking bread for the traders and shepherds who passed through the high routes, growing what vegetables she could in a sheltered terrace just outside the cave during the brief mountain summers, and storing enough through careful preservation to see herself and Ellen through even the harshest winters. The oven, she explained with evident pride, had taken her husband nearly a year to carve and build properly into the rock, drawing on skills he had learned from his own father, and it had more than repaid that labor 100 times over in the years since, providing not just warmth but a livelihood that made her independent of any village's charity or judgment. She spoke, too, of the donkey and the mule that came and went with traders throughout the season, of the shepherds who left cheese and wool in exchange for bread and shelter from sudden storms, of a whole quiet economy of mutual aid that existed up in these high passes, invisible to those who lived comfortably in the valleys below and assumed that anyone dwelling alone in the mountains must surely be suffering, must surely be waiting for rescue. As the night deepened and the storm outside showed no signs of relenting, Marta insisted that Elias and Toby stay, laying out blankets near the fire and refusing any suggestion that they might try to press on, even after the weather cleared. "The mountain does not forgive impatience," she told them firmly, and something in her tone made it clear this was not a point open for debate. Toby, exhausted and full for the first time in 2 days, fell asleep almost as soon as he lay down, the dog curling up against his side as though sensing the boy needed the comfort of warmth and companionship after such a harrowing climb. Elias stayed awake a while longer, talking quietly with Marta as she finished her evening tasks, banking the fire and checking on the last of the day's baking, and in that conversation, he found himself telling her things about his father's final years that he had not even shared with his own brother, the quiet grief of watching a strong man grow weak, the strange comfort of fulfilling a dying wish, even when it led him somewhere as unexpected as this. Marta listened with the patient attentiveness of someone who had spent many long winters alone with her own thoughts, and had learned the value of truly hearing another person speak. By the time Elias finally drifted to sleep, the storm had begun to soften, its violent howling settling into a gentler, steadier snowfall, and when he woke the next morning to the smell of fresh bread once again filling the cave, sunlight was breaking weakly through the skylight overhead, illuminating motes of flour dust drifting through the warm air. Ellen was already awake, humming to herself as she helped her grandmother pack loaves into a basket for the day's trading, and Toby sat up rubbing his eyes, looking around at the cave in the clearer light of morning with an expression of wonder that made Marta laugh warmly and tell him he looked like a boy seeing snow for the first time, which, in a way that mattered, he nearly was. Elias spent that morning helping where he could, hauling water and stacking firewood, small tasks that felt inadequate against the debt of hospitality he now owed this woman, but which she accepted with the easy grace of someone accustomed to guests wanting to make themselves useful. Before he left, Elias asked Marta the question his father had truly sent him to ask, whether she would consider coming down to the valley, where she would want for nothing and would never again face a mountain winter alone. Marta considered the offer seriously, he could tell, weighing it with the same careful attention she brought to everything else. But in the end, she shook her head with a small, contented smile. "Tell your father, wherever his memory now rests, that I thank him for his concern, as I thanked him 30 years ago for surviving despite his own stubbornness. But I am not the frozen widow he perhaps imagined all these years, waiting for rescue in some crumbling hut. I have built a life here, a good one, with my granddaughter and my bread and my mountain, and I would not trade it for all the comfort of the valley below." She pressed a warm loaf into his hands as he prepared to leave, and another into Toby's, along with dried herbs and a small jar of preserves for the journey home, refusing any payment beyond his promise to visit again when the weather allowed, and to bring his own children someday, so that Ellen would have more company than an old dog and a patient grandmother during the long mountain winters. As Elias and Toby made their way back down the mountain that afternoon, the sky clearing to a brilliant, hard blue above the snow-blanketed peaks, Elias found himself laughing quietly to himself, a sound that startled Toby until he explained what had struck him so suddenly. They had climbed that mountain expecting tragedy, prepared to find death and to carry home nothing but confirmation of a sad ending to a story his father had carried with guilt and worry for 30 years. Instead, they had found warmth in the unlikeliest of places, fresh bread rising in a stone oven carved from a mountain's heart, a woman who had turned solitude into abundance and hardship into a thriving, generous life, and a family bound not by blood alone but by the quiet, enduring gratitude that connects those who have helped and been helped across the vast, indifferent distance of years. When Elias finally reached the valley and stood once more before his father's grave, he did not bring news of tragedy or of rescue, but something far better, the simple, satisfying truth that some stories, against all expectation, end not in loss but in the discovery that the person you feared lost to the cold had, all along, been the one keeping the fire burning for others who might one day need to find their way in from the storm.